Here is a picture of some chocolates, and there's the name. And I usually don't look at the name of chocolates very much. I'm just trying to usually get the ones I like. In this case, typically Maltesers. Others are available. But some of you may have noticed, some of you may not have noticed, that in this case, these chocolates, the name of the chocolates is actually made up of lots of different fonts, lots of different styles. Now, these may actually seem fairly familiar, and that's for good reason, because they are familiar. They're all taken from the wrappers, from the brand names of other familiar chocolates. So if you're familiar with chocolates, then you'll recognise these fonts from the individual chocolates that make up the collection. The designer has taken something that's already there, chopped it up, cut and paste style, put it back together to make something new out of familiar brand symbols, all mashed together. There's a slogan about art. It's attributed to Pablo Picasso, and it is the idea that all art is theft. I think I would have to agree in a good way. I subscribe to the idea that there is really nothing new to discover or invent, that in actual fact, if something is new, it's probably not true, and vice versa. I believe truth is there to be discovered and then rediscovered, and that's why I try never to say anything new. I'd much rather say something that's true. I love cut and paste. I've used cut and paste all my life in different ways, editing things, putting them together. I used to be in a band, and when we made publicity materials, posters and flyers for the band, what we would do is we would chop and cut and paste bits out of comics, bits out of other posters or images, album covers that we liked, and put them all together and make our own posters out of them. I even covered my old bass guitar in exactly the same way, just taking all bits and pieces out of things that I liked, cutting and pasting them, sticking them together. Greg and Chloe, who often put stuff together for a Sunday morning, are doing the same sort of thing, editing what other people have created or recorded or discovered, and putting them together in a way that's going to spark people's imagination. All of this is why, one of the reasons why I'm so excited to be talking about a letter in this collection of books we call the Bible. A letter that's known as Revelation, or more properly, the Revelation. I'm excited because the writer is an artist, someone who loves God, takes him seriously, who loves people, takes them seriously, really cares, but also loves words and takes them seriously. Last Sunday, in the breakout rooms after our service, Emily joked with me, but it was going to take a long time to get through Revelation if we only did tiny little chunks like we did last week. And there's a bit of truth behind that, because this letter is so rich, it has so many layers to it, that I could actually write a sermon on every word. I'm not going to do that. The writer of this letter calls himself John. Now, it's not clear if this is the same John that was a student, a disciple, a follower of Jesus in the 3 years that we have described in the life and the death and the resurrection stories that we have in the 4 books that we know as Gospels. It's not clear if this John is the same John who wrote one of those Gospels. But what we can decide, reading the letter, is that this is a Jewish follower of Jesus of Nazareth, writing round about the end of the 1st century, so around about AD 90, and is writing to encourage groups of Jesus followers who are struggling in the face of an all-pervasive Roman Empire and culture. So in that situation, your Jewish friends and rabbis think that you've completely gone off the track following this Jesus movement, and then at the same time the Greek and the Roman culture is around you, tempting you and oppressing you and beating you down and forcing you to take part in 1,000 tiny ways that feel like they're going against something deep inside of you. John introduces himself as a brother, a companion or a partner in the ongoing suffering and in the patient endurance, and a partner in something called the kingdom, which is something we're going to come back to. John himself knows what his listeners are going through, because he himself, his whole life His whole message, his whole ministry, serving people, has been about two things. The word of God, he says, and the testimony of Jesus. Both the same thing, actually. And clinging to that so much has upset the authorities, so much that they have actually put him on lockdown, put him in quarantine on an island called Patmos, about 35 miles off the coast. His crime is fascinating because in that setting, his crime must have been atheism. Refusing to believe and to worship the emperor as divine. The emperor of the time, Domitian, was notorious for declaring himself God the Lord and expecting everyone to worship him. And John must have been so vocal about refusing that he was exiled to this island. But meanwhile, he's not sitting quietly in on his island feeling sorry for himself, feeling sorry for his fellow partners. He is getting creative. What inspires him? Well, he tells us that on the Lord's Day, which would have been the Sunday was Resurrection Day, when you remembered Jesus rising from the death, he is inspired by spending time with God. He's presumably in prayer or in worship. He's so carried away, he says, in God's presence, in the Spirit, that he has a vision which he's then commanded to write down. John first actually hears and then he sees someone. He hears a voice like a trumpet, and as soon as this description starts, you and I might start to think, well, this all sounds a bit strange. But John's first listeners would not have found these kinds of phrases strange. They would have found them really familiar. Just like the writing on the chocolate box. All the parts seem familiar, they're just made up in a new way. You see, John doesn't include anything in his letter that is new. Not one thing. There are about 400 verses or sentences in the Revelation. And in those 400 verses, there are over 500 references, allusions, symbols or images directly from the previous 65 books in this collection of the scriptures. Cut and paste, cut and paste. John is an artist, and he's a cut and paste kind of artist like me. I'm going to put an image up that might seem a little bit familiar. And that's because it's based on another image that we took just a couple of weeks ago when the Rowetts introduced the service. But if you look closer and zoom in on this image, you find that in actual fact it's an image made up of lots of other images, and those images are actually previous theme artworks that we've used over the years, taking something old and familiar and putting it in a new way to spark the imagination and get someone thinking. John is doing the same. Every word, every phrase is soaked in his Jewish story, in the God story, in the Jesus of Nazareth story. And this is one of the ways he's going to get a reaction out of the people who are hearing this read out. Cut and paste. A voice like a trumpet reminds his Jewish readers of when God spoke to the whole Jewish nation on a mountain in Exodus in chapter 19. When John then turns to see the voice, turning to see a voice, what a great phrase, he then sees golden lampstands. The golden lampstand, the 7 lamps in it, is the menorah which stood in the temple, the place where God and people were connected. And then John sees a figure, a person, someone, he says, like a son of man. And again, cut and paste. His readers are hearing familiar words jammed together in new ways. The Son of Man comes from a book called Daniel. And Daniel was a hugely important book to the Jewish people at different times in their history when they felt that they had abandoned God and everything was going wrong, and they had to hold on to some sort of hope about what God would do to sort things out. And in there, the Son of Man is that figure. A figure that's actually connected to another phrase that we're going to have reference to really quickly, which is the Ancient of Days, which was basically a phrase for God himself. This figure is dressed in a robe with a golden sash. That's how the high priests in the temple dressed. This figure's hair is like white, like wool, eyes blazing with fire, feet like bronze, voice like rushing waters. Cut and paste, cut and paste. The Ancient of Days in the book of Daniel was white as snow, white like wool, flaming with fire, feet like bronze, voice like a multitude. A voice like rushing waters comes from a book called Ezekiel, which is another set of messages about what God will do in the future. The very title, first and last, that this person, obviously a representation of Jesus, gives himself, is the kind of thing that God would use to describe himself throughout the scriptures. And John mixes it all up, cutting it on top of each other, mashing it together. He's not trying to describe what this figure looks like. The most repeated words in his letter are like. It's like. He's using words to describe something that can't be described in words, but yet he's still doing it because he's an artist. Now, I said that the Caesar, the emperor, the controller of the entire known world of the time, Domitian, had taken emperor worship to a new level, declared himself God and Lord, and had spread a gospel, he called it, an evangelion, across his empire in lots of different ways, in festivals and circuses, with temples, with artwork, and especially coins that everybody had to use to take part in the empire and the images on them. One of the most notorious images on these coins was the emperor as God holding the stars in the sky, the 7 planets that were known at the time. No, says John in this vision. No, you don't hold the stars in the sky. Jesus of Nazareth holds the stars in the sky. He is the real Lord and God, not you. He is the risen Jesus of Nazareth, Son of God, and he holds the stars in his hands. And John can't help but fall face down at Jesus' feet, which is actually what he refused to do for the emperor. Now, it would be so easy to hang on to a set of images in my head about Jesus of Nazareth. To think about an ancient Near Eastern rabbi, maybe with long hair and blue eyes, and maybe think about him wandering around a scrap of Palestine in the 1st century, with some confused teenage fishermen with him, uttering quotable quotes and healing some poor people. That's a cosy, safe Jesus. That's also a severely limited Jesus, stuck in the past, stuck in a book, stuck in a book. John writes about a living, breathing, terrifying at this point Jesus, not a cosy, cuddly Jesus. In this presence, John can do nothing but fall on his face, and then this Jesus reassures him in the words, the command that's most often heard in the scriptures, and says, do not be afraid, and even touches him on his shoulder to reassure him. Jesus of Nazareth was crucified by the empire. For so many people, he's in the past. But the Jesus in John's vision is not in the past. He calls himself the living one, not the crucified one, not the kept in the past one. Jesus says, I was dead, but look, now I am alive forever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. Now, before we end up down a rabbit hole here, death and Hades is actually a phrase together. It's like heaven and earth. There are phrases in these scriptures that mean the totality of something. So heaven and earth doesn't mean two different things. It means everything. And death and Hades is the same. It just means what happens after death. Hades, or Sheol, was a description in the ancient Near East of the place of the dead. And John is saying that because of his life and his death and his resurrection, because of what God has done, death is defeated. This is what God always had in mind. God's plan was always for life, for new creation, for resurrection, for putting things to right, so death will not have the last word in the story. And John's vision, or this first of 7 visions actually, will finish with Jesus telling John that the 7 stars, the 7 lampstands, are these 7 churches he's writing to, representing all the churches in the world. This letter is about a Jesus who is alive, who is at work, and who most importantly, where was Jesus standing among the 7 lampstands in this vision? Right in the middle, in the now, in the midst, in the 7 groups of struggling Jesus followers, struggling to be a light, a blessing where they are, in the face of the resistance of the empire. But Jesus is in their midst, not sitting on a cloud, not stuck in the past, not trapped in a book, but alive, present, knowing exactly what they're going through and at work with his people, helping, sustaining, encouraging in the struggle, in the task that they were made for, to be priests, to put God on show, to be a light, to bring a blessing to the people around them. And notice the last thing in the description, because nothing here is here by accident or in order by accident. The last piece of the description is Jesus' face shining in all its brilliance. In these scriptures, what is the ultimate blessing prayed for anyone? A blessing that we come back to time and time again, a blessing that's caught the imagination in new ways over the last few weeks. A blessing we sang together last Sunday. The ultimate blessing in Scripture is to pray that God will make his face to shine upon you. This is the last image burned into John's imagination in his vision. And that's not by accident. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. My prayer, just like last week and every week, will be the blessing that is in this letter. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it and take to heart what is written in it.